Hello, and welcome to History Bytes. Today, we're sticking with the Pacific War theme and talking about the Japanese light tank, the Type 95 Hargo, which, for the sake of time, I'll just be calling the Hargo from here on. Let's get some background. It's 1933, and Japan is planning on expanding. Now, I've talked about Japanese ambitions before, and to help with their conquest into resource-rich areas, the Japanese needed an armoured vehicle that was quick and effective against infantry to succeed. The Japanese practiced with mechanised warfare a little bit in the early 1930s, but the infantry wasn't keen on the prototypes they'd seen because of their poor infantry support capability. However, the Hargo saw use in Manchuria in 1934 and 1935, and the soldiers began to like the vehicle. Larger production began in 1936 under Mitsubishi, and in 1938 mass production began. The infantry was still not sure on the design due to light armour, but it was pointed out that this was to make the tank quicker. Multiple companies produced the tank, but the largest was still Mitsubishi. The design. The Hargo had a crew of 3 members, but the tank could still be operated to a degree if a member of the crew was knocked out, but it would be far less effective. The crew would typically be made up of a driver, a machine gunner, and a commander. The commander would be in charge of the main gun, as well as aiming, observation, and general decision making. The small tank was notoriously cramped and uncomfortable. The main armament of the tank was a Type 94 37mm tank gun, which, confusingly, is not the same as the Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun. Japanese military naming conventions are very complicated and difficult to follow. The gun the Hargo had carried both armour-piercing and high-explosive shells, and while sources differ, the armour-piercing shell could pierce up to 36mm of armour from 275 metres. That is not a lot compared to 75mm Sherman guns, which could do twice as good from the same range, and the crew would be a lot safer and less cramped. The Hargo also supported a pair of 7.7mm machine guns that were originally 6.5mm, but the calibre was increased. One machine gun would be in the hull to perform an assortment of fire rolls. The other machine gun would be at the back of the turret as a sort of additional armament. The suspension on Japanese tanks is distinctive, as it's uncomfortable and rough on harsh terrain, but reliable and cheap, and sufficient space was provided in headspace to minimise risk of injury on rough terrain. The engine was 120 horsepower as a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder diesel engine, which was powerful for the tank and it gave it good speed and mobility. At war. The Hargo was used pretty much everywhere Japan could get it from 1938 onwards. It saw use in Khalkhin Gol against the Soviet Union in 1939, where they were very effective at breaking through the Soviet lines at night, but a lot of their success derived from favourable conditions and the competence of their commander, Colonel Tamada, who managed to outmaneuver the Soviet lines. In China, the tank surprisingly didn't see huge amounts of use, and later in the Second World War, the Chinese had been taught how to dispatch the tanks effectively, so they never proved an immense issue. In Malaysia and the Philippines, however, the tanks were used effectively. Again, a lot of their success derives from their use of surprise attack and the Allied lack of preparedness for the assaults, but the small tanks proved themselves to be reliable and effective in the harsh terrain and led many successful charges on Allied positions. As the war went on, however, the small gun and light armour began to cause issues for Japan. By mid-1943, Japan didn't have the resources it needed to create stronger tanks, so they were forced to continue using the Hargo, and it started to go wrong for Japan. Against Australian forces in New Guinea in 1942, the Australians were initially pushed back, but the conditions proved even too tough for the Hargo, and the vehicles were abandoned, leaving the Japanese without armoured support against a very tough Australian force, who quickly gained the upper hand. The Japanese did not catch a break. After failing against the Australians, the Hargo next faced the wrath of the United States Marine Corps, again in 1942. They saw initial success at Guadalcanal against the American M2A4 Stuarts, but the Americans upgraded their armour, and at Saipan in 1944 were ready to face Japanese armour. The Hargo faced the Marines on Saipan, where they were a fair match for the American light M3 Stuart tanks, but the Japanese tanks were easily dispatched by the Americans' M4A2 Shermans, 75mm half-tracks, 37mm anti-tank guns and bazookas. On Saipan, against the Marines, the Hargos attacked in the largest Japanese tank assault of the Second World War. It was a very costly error for the Hargo to assault the American lines, where none of the Hargo survived. On Okinawa, the situation had grown worse for the Hargo, where just 13 Hargos, along with 14 Chiha medium tanks, faced off against 800 American tanks and 2 Marine battalions. The Americans very easily handled the Hargo by the end of the war. Over on the British and Indian lines in Burma, it was a slightly different situation, where Allied armour was more scarce and the weather and terrain was more rough. That being said, the British were initially worried about their defence using the outdated Matilda infantry tank, but it turned out that the Hargo couldn't penetrate the old British tank's armour. After the M4 Sherman became widely available to Britain from America, the British moved their newer M3 medium tanks to Burma, where they heavily outclassed the Hargo, and on every front, the lightness of the Hargo had become an immense weakness for Japan. The Hargo could effectively handle virtually none of the Allied armour. Overall, just like the Zero in the skies, when the Hargo was first debuted, it was one of the best vehicles in the world, but the economic situation of Japan meant that they could not develop and evolve their armour at the same rate as the Allies. This meant that while the Hargo was fine against infantry, by late 1943, Japanese light tanks had lost all credibility, and every one of Japan's enemies, which was a lot of people, was able to counter the vehicle. It had still proved itself as a capable fighting vehicle, however, in the early stages of the war, and was the most produced Japanese armoured vehicle of the war, with 2,300 being produced. Surviving tanks are still in Australia, the US, Russia, Thailand, and the UK. I hope you enjoyed today's episode on the Type 94 Hargo light tank. If you learned something new, press like and subscribe if you're new, leave a comment on what you thought, and I'll see you next time.